Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, January 25th, 2021, and today I've got a bit of a different kind of episode than what I normally do. I want to talk very briefly. I'm not going to give a great detailed overview, but I want to give just a general history of the U.S. supported and funded war on Yemen, which is probably the worst humanitarian crisis on Earth right now. So I've got a very basic background of what really started out as a civil war back in 2014, and then I'm going to go through an overview of the U.S. involvement in that from that point until today. But then I'm going to go through some insight on foreign policy and what they could call entangling alliances from people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. But I've got a ton of advice on foreign policy, peace, and neutrality from the first president under the United States, Constitution for the United States, that is George Washington. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. All the archives for about 2.5-ish years. On individual episodes, I link to things that I reference and talk about. Generally try to get everything in there. But today I'll have articles. I've got some encyclopedia pages or wiki pages. I've got speeches from Jefferson and Madison and Washington. I've got another paper from Thomas Paine that I'll include in there. Basically stuff that you can read and learn more on your own time. Of course, we have all the different platforms, and I like taking a moment to mention this in case we get booted from somewhere. You can find us live streaming, of course, on the mainstream platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter or Periscope. We're also on DLive live streaming. We also are on Twitch, and we have archive video versions at Gab TV, Library.tv, Odyssey.com, Brighteon, and BitChute. Plus the podcast editions at Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podbean, and elsewhere. Find all those and more, plus our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. All spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And while we give people another minute or so to get notifications so they can join us for this very important live stream video, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I see Bob Landry out there, Dixie Strong, Funky Euphemism in the Twin Cities. Bob is in San Antonio. Heather Rossi, Leslie G, good to see you. Leslie Clay, Kent, and Dan Reed. Hey, Dan. Dan does the Culinary Libertarian podcast that you guys should definitely check out as well. It's really a cool cross-section of stuff. Lawrence Smith in West Virginia, MRGF, Patricia Dance in Syracuse, Michael White, Adrienne Smith, Jacobsmeyer. Let's see who else here. Marcus, I appreciate you being here with us as well. And I apologize if I missed anybody, but thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. And I want to first just get right into this. And I know a lot of you are already aware that something is happening. Some people certainly aren't, because this has been really one of the most underreported foreign policy stories. Well, it's not just foreign policy, because it's not just about engagement or talking. That's a policy decision. I guess you could call a policy decision a unilateral executive action to get involved in a foreign war, a regional war, or a civil war. But there has been a pretty vicious civil war happening in Yemen. And if you're like me, when you first heard about it, I went to government school. So that means a lot of the skills that I should have are really deficient. I'm pretty bad at geography. I got to look at a map. I mean, I got to use my phone to do basic math because government school sucks. Anyways, so when I first had to look this up, when I learned about it years ago, primarily listening to Scott Horton's podcast. And for example, if you really want to get some real detail on everything that's going on in regards to the foreign policy and the war and other wars as well, of course, you want to check out the Scott Horton Show, which I listen to almost religiously when I'm able to. But here up on the screen, you can see that there is a bunch of color-coded sections, and this is really the best way that I know to show what is happening as far as this very vicious, faction-based civil war happening in Yemen since 2014. Of course, there was some buildup before then, but it really exploded, and that's not necessarily intended to be a pun. And you have two main factions. If you're looking on the screen, you can see the red area. This is I believe the guy's name is the Hadi-led government. That's kind of like the establishment, the government that had been there all along. They actually are controlling about, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of the country. It's not like the main city areas. The green area is a faction called the Houthis, and these are an armed group of like Islamist nationalist rebels in Yemen. Now, mind you, all the sides in this kind of a war are very problematic, and I'm being kind saying that. This is a nasty, violent, murderous war with bad people on all sides. Now, there's actually 5 main factions, but the main ones are the Hadi-led Yemen government. You'll just hear people talk about, well, the Yemeni government, and then the Houthis. Now, in early 2015, Hadi was actually ousted by the Houthis. So the government was, having some pushback, and they actually overran the capital. And so this president ran off and fled to his neighbors and his allies militarily in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is no land of the free without a doubt, and I'm certain that Yemen is not as well. But he went there and he asked for military help. And so, of course, Saudi Arabia wanted to get involved because they were picking sides in this kind of regional neighborhood civil war. And that kind of thing is going to happen. Like, if there is a civil war in Canada, I'm certain that people in the United States are going to take a lot of interest in that. But Saudi Arabia codenamed this, and maybe it'll ring a bell, maybe where they got this from. It was called Operation Decisive Storm. The intervention, I'm reading from Wikipedia, the intervention initially consisted of a bombing campaign on the Houthi rebels and later a naval blockade and the deployment of ground forces into Yemen. Going further, fighter jets and ground forces from Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Sudan, the UAE. UAE fell out, I think, in 2019 or so. The coalition has kind of been the coalition of the willing, I guess, of modern times has kind of been crumbling a little bit. Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Academy as a company, which used to be called Blackwater. They've all taken part in this. And then other areas, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, have all made their airspace, territorial waters, and military bases available to the coalition. Now, it's a mess, and a lot of people are dying. As of October 31st, 2019, this is from ACLED. It's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. They're really kind of just doing the actual number, the statistics. You can actually download their CSV, their spreadsheets, looking at the type of information that they're using. Actually, that might be from the bombing campaign one. I'll get to that back in a moment. I'm not sure if you can actually download all their info. Let's take a look here. Yeah, data export tool. Yeah, you can actually export their data and verify it third party. So the ACLED currently records more than 100,000 reported fatalities as of October 31st, 2019, since 2015, including over 12,000 civilians killed in direct attacks. Now, that's just the direct stuff, the actual death from conflict. Sanctions, of course, and blockades are also acts of war, and they kill people too. And the result has not been really good. They're restricting access to important supplies and needs, and as the sanctions regime that was against Iraq in the ramp up to, I guess that would have been Iraq War II by the Clinton administration some years ago in the 90s, that resulted in tons of people dying. Where, of course, there's numbers that are fudged by both sides on that. The winners in history always want to make it look lower, and the losers want to make it look higher. I don't know the real number, but a lot of people died because of these sanctions. And so far, the estimates are saying about 131,000 people have died from indirect causes, such as lack of food, health services, and infrastructure. And that includes 3,153 child deaths. So a lot of people are actually getting killed, and we're seeing studies that are saying as many as 6 million people are on the verge of famine. 6 million people, 2 million people are starving currently. This is a total disaster. Whatever you think of one side or the other, the fact is they are waging a violent war against each other. They're all bad people, and the result is average human beings are getting caught up in this and getting their lives absolutely destroyed. In many cases, just completely ended. Now, this isn't just as you should probably be aware by now, and you could tell at least from my opening here, this isn't just a localized civil war. This isn't just a localized regional war. Surprise, surprise. In March 2015, then President, Peace President, Nobel Peace Prize winner declared that he had authorized personally, unilaterally, the U.S. president authorized U.S. forces to provide logistical and intelligence support to the Saudis in their military intervention in Yemen. Now, mind you, if this is kind of an anti-9/11 thing, we know that a majority of the people responsible, or that the U.S. government tells us is responsible for the attack on the Twin Towers 9/11-2001 came from Saudi Arabia. Somehow, we're supposed to be allies with these people. It's crazy who gets the entangling alliances in U.S. foreign policy. But so the president at that point, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and of course this is one of the many reasons that the Nobel Peace Prize is a total sham. I mean, it's absurd to say that this guy was a peace president. Anyways, he unilaterally authorized U.S. forces to provide logistical and intelligence support to the Saudis in their military intervention in Yemen. Again, picking sides in a local civil war, regional war, established a joint planning cell with Saudi Arabia. This includes aerial refueling, permitting coalition aircraft more loitering time over Yemen, allowing them to do more bombing raids. They cut that off. The most recent administration brought that back in. It permitted some coalition members to home base aircraft rather than relocate them to Saudi Arabia. So it's really, really bad stuff. Here again in Wikipedia, the U.S., it's interesting that they put it as a past tense because it is not past tense. It is still happening. It is happening now. And in fact, there's been a real aggressive ramp up recently. The U.S. provided past tense, incorrect, provides intelligence and logistical support, including aerial refueling and search and rescue for downed coalition pilots. It also accelerated the sale of weapons to coalition states and continued strikes against AQAP. This is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It is one of the tiny factions. If we look back at this map, I think it is the little white space here. It is a tiny, tiny faction, and that's all they need to have an excuse to be engaged in an entire civil war because of the open-ended, unconstitutional authorization to use military force, which really was Congress unconstitutionally transferring its power to declare war against the perpetrators of the 2001 attacks, transferred that to the executive branch, and made it open-ended so the executive branch could do whatever they wanted against whoever they wanted and just claim that it's terrorism. That's not how things are supposed to go. Totally unconstitutional, and it's unmoral. So we're not really talking about the constitutionality today. The U.S. and Britain have deployed, back to Wikipedia, their military personnel in the command and control center responsible for Saudi-led airstrikes on Yemen, having access to lists of targets. Now, the U.S. Navy has also played, and I'm not really aware of how detailed this goes. Maybe Horton would probably have better coverage on this. Antiwar.com is another good place to read. The U.S. Navy also did participate, or has been participating as a supporting role in the blockade. Going further, here's some examples of actually more direct involvement, and then I'm going to get into some details in just a minute or so about the air bombing campaign, which is huge. In 2015, the U.S. deployed the Green Berets to assist the Saudi Arabian military with missile interception. In 2016, the USS Nitsa fired, and I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, fired Tomahawk missiles at Houthi-controlled radar sites. In 2017, now this is the crazy part, it's like a grift. They're selling weapons, providing logistics in this war. And then at the same time, they're sending $600 million of so-called foreign aid. Now, foreign aid is, first of all, they're stealing the money from you and I, or they're printing it and then just stealing our purchasing power. It's the inflation tax. This is doing violence against our liberty, this whole printing press and handing out cash to favored nations or playing basically both sides in conflicts, which is what they do quite a bit. But in 2017 alone, the U.S., or maybe as of, I'm not sure the detail there, but the U.S. sent a total of about $600 million of foreign aid to Yemen, despite being a supporter of the Saudi-led military intervention. I would point out that the Saudi-led intervention would not happen without U.S. and U.K. support. It just wouldn't exist. And this type of thing, mind you, this was a unilateral executive action started in 2015, and it continued, and it is continuing today. We'd like to see it end, and I know some people have their fingers crossed and hope that it will end, and I do hope that as well. But I'm not sure that that's going to happen. Anyways, it's totally different from how the founders told us to deal with foreign policy and conflicts around the world. Here's Thomas Jefferson, March 4th, 1801, his famous phrase, his policy of his government that he was administrating was peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Certainly the alliance with Saudi Arabia is entangling, because it draws the country into another conflict. And I'm going to talk about George Washington's more specific warnings on this in just a moment. Here's James Madison a few years later, March 4th, March-ish, 1809. He says, "It has been the true glory of the United States." Mind you, he is actually talking about the success of his predecessor in office. That was Thomas Jefferson. He says, "It has been the true glory of the United States to cultivate peace." We think of the founders as being very willing to go to war, but they only thought of the war for independence, the war of secession against the great empire of Great Britain at that time, as a very last resort. And it was a last resort because Parliament claimed the power over the people of the colonies in what they called, literally in law, all cases whatsoever. And so the response was basically like, it doesn't matter what they say or do today. They're claiming an unlimited, unilateral, arbitrary power. We can never be free. We have no choice but to resist. They're already using violence against us in increasing ways. And so we have to get away. They considered it very much a last resort. People like John Dickinson urged them even to hold out even further, because he was concerned that they might lose. They did not have the forces needed, and therefore, if you lose, then you're really, really in trouble. Wait for the right time. I mean, this is a very unique historical thing that happened, this American Revolution, this war for independence. Most of the time in a situation like that, you end up with a crushing dictator that rises out of the ashes. Think someone like Mao, for example. So Madison recognized that peace was much preferable to war and conflict. He says, "It has been the true glory of the United States to cultivate peace by observing justice, and to entitle themselves to the respect of the nations at war," recognizing there was a ton of war happening already, "respect of the nations at war by fulfilling their neutral obligations with the most scrupulous impartiality." Totally neutral is what Madison was saying. To cherish, and his advice for what they needed to do was to cherish peace and friendly intercourse with all nations having correspondent dispositions. To maintain sincere neutrality toward belligerent nations. Neutrality towards nations at war is what Madison said, what Jefferson said, even what Adams said. And I will get to George Washington here in a few minutes. To prefer, Madison says, in all cases, amicable discussion and reasonable accommodation of differences to a decision of them by an appeal to arms. Now, it's not like, and some people have told me over the last few years, oh, they're just kind of doing what they do. They're giving a little bit of money here. They're kind of involved. But it's really these other guys. It's really the Saudis that are the problem. And certainly the Saudi government is a tyrannical government. It is a warmongering government. And probably all sides of the faction in Yemen are also warmongers as well. We don't want, that's the whole point. That's what the founders told us about. Don't pick sides in these things, because that's what the people were really escaping, were the conflicts of Europe at that time. They wanted to get away from this choosing of sides and live in a land of peace and liberty instead. So here, just in December, about a month ago, on the 23rd, the administration was pushing forward. This is from antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, who does a ton of awesome reporting over there. I follow him on Twitter as well. I think it's like DeCamp Dave at Twitter. Anyways, the administration is pushing forward a sale of 7,500 precision-guided missiles to Saudi Arabia. The sale is estimated to be worth about $478 million. I'm not sure if that one went through. I know that I'll get to another one in just a moment. But basically, this is really, really ramping up in the last few weeks of the previous administration. They're generally really aggressive about getting more weaponry into the hands of one side of this 5- or 6-sided war, which is just nuts. It is opposite of what the founders recommended. The State Department, again from Dave's report, notified Congress that it is issuing a license to Raytheon that will enable the weapons maker to make the sale directly to Saudi Arabia. And if you think about it, man, there's so many layers to this. It's gun control. It's gun control on a global scale. It's basically the U.S. government telling who can sell what weapons to who. And this is just bad if you think about it in principle. The U.S. government should not be involved in that. But then it's also a type of a corporatism, which I know the phrase is actually really not Mussolini, but Mussolini, the general concept was the Italian fascism was really more of a corporatist structure, and that is a government on top of basically different corporations running different industries. And that's kind of what's going on in this military-industrial complex with organizations or companies like Raytheon. They're just sitting there waiting for the green light from the government, and then they're partnered with the U.S. government in making these deals with other countries, favored nation status, whatever it may be. And so the State Department just unilaterally notifies Congress, this is what we're doing. And then just a few days later, again, Dave DeCamp reports on December 29th, the State Department approved another one, a potential sale of Boeing-made precision-guided bombs to Saudi Arabia, worth an estimated $290 million. And someone would probably correct me. I'm not sure if they both went through, but we're talking, if they did, we're talking in just a week, like $800 million worth of military hardware, missiles. It's not like the U.S. government isn't actively engaged in this horrible conflict. Now, in 2019, DeCamp writes, Congress actually passed, both houses, House and Senate, they actually passed legislation to block these arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Surprise, surprise, Congress is horrible. They almost never do the right thing. And maybe they only did the right thing because they knew it was going to be grandstanding. They knew that it was going to get a veto, but that's what happened. One of the few vetoes used, and of course, it's to restrict executive unilateral war powers that were initiated by the so-called peace president, the Nobel Peace Prize winning warmonger. So Congress passed this legislation. The president also used his veto powers that year on a bill that called for an end to the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. So Congress has surprisingly done-ish the right thing on this a couple of times. That I have a hard time actually acknowledging that because I'm sure there's something behind the scenes that made it garbage, but certainly trying to end that war is very, very good. Now, again, the bombing situation is really bad. It's not like a little bit here and there. They are using these, and they're using them in a huge way. This is the Yemen Data Project. The export on this one, I know for sure you can get the exact listing, the date, the location, etc., of all the bombing attacks that they've been able to verify. 22,485 as of, I guess, today, YemenDataProject.org, 22,485. Another thing that I did not learn well in school, I already mentioned, is math. Government-run schools. So what is that? I don't know. We'll say it's like 6.5 years. 22,485 divided by 6.5. That's 3,459 per year divided by 365. It's 9.5 bombing raids per day. Literally per day, 9 times, U.S.-backed warplanes are dropping bombs in Yemen. This is terrible. And mind you, it's causing a lot of people to die. Here again at antiwar.com, this was from September 2019. As of that point, around 67% of all reported civilian fatalities since 2015 have been caused by U.S. Saudi-led coalition airstrikes. 2/3 of them. It's not, I mean, the civil war itself between these horrible factions is bad, and it's killing people, and it's causing starvation and famine and death and all kinds of problems. The blockade makes it worse. And then the civilians that are being killed, 2/3 of them are coming from the U.S. bombs, Raytheon, Boeing, and the like. Now let's look at what George Washington advised for foreign policy. Pretty much the same thing that his predecessors, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and I didn't really get into Adams today, and James Madison all advised. And this is how Washington put it. He said, and this is his farewell address, which I've been citing a lot. And now, mind you, I don't cover this portion of his farewell address much. I talk about usurpation and factions leading to a frightful despotism quite a bit. Usurpation, violations of the Constitution, turning a blind eye to those. That's what I cover. But really the last, about a third of this pretty long, it's not a speech, it's an article. It was published in a newspaper at the time on September 19th, 1796. But the last third of it is talking about foreign policy, peace, and neutrality. George Washington, General Washington, the father of his country, Revolutionary War hero, historic level of hero. And he's saying, observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. And being a strong, religious-minded man, Washington followed that up by saying religion and morality enjoin this conduct. It urges or it prescribes. So if you're a religious person, if you're a moral person, you will have this conduct of observing good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivating peace and harmony with all. But he says quite a bit more, and I'm not going to cover all of it, but I want to read a few sections here from George Washington talking about foreign policy and really neutrality. That is so important that I don't think we pay attention to enough. And we don't pay attention to enough even more so because it comes from General Washington, not just President Washington. He says, in the execution of such a plan, this peace and harmony, nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachment for others should be excluded. Don't have a permanent bond with any one nation or a permanent hatred against any one nation. That has to be excluded, according to George Washington. He says that in place of them, just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or a habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. Some people might say the U.S. government is a slave to the Saudi government in this situation. A habitual fondness in many ways for that government, no matter what it's involved in, the atrocities that it commits on a daily basis, those people shouldn't be supported. Washington says it is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. They shouldn't have an attachment to another country. And John Dickinson at one point, he was the penman of the Revolution. He specifically said our attachment should be to no other nation on earth. Our attachment needs to be to liberty. Liberty, as Patrick Henry put it. Liberty used to be the primary object. Going forward, a little bit more from George Washington. He says, so likewise, a passionate detachment of one nation for another, it produces a variety of evils. I'm just going to go through just a little bit. He says, sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. Mind you, there was no congressional declaration of war against Yemen. There is no congressional declaration of war against Yemen. There's an open-ended, unconstitutional authorization to use military force that allows the executive branch to pick and choose whoever the executive branch determines is allied with the terrorist acts of September 11th, and at best, they really, really, really are stretching that. But I think it is just garbage. It shouldn't have existed. And Washington warned us about these types of things. He warned us about this type of open-ended attachment to one country or another, or antipathies against another, because it draws you into conflicts, like a civil war in Yemen, that you shouldn't be involved in the first place. He says it leads also to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concessions. By unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained, like the money, the weaponry. Like, if you're going to talk about national defense isn't arming up everybody else or picking sides in different conflicts. And by exciting jealousy, ill will, and a disposition to retaliate, Washington writes, in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. It's just conflict. It's just bad. It's never something that the founders actually advised. Now, in the end, I think I might have a little bit more from Washington here. Oh, yeah, I got to do a little bit more here. I'm sorry about just reading through this. I encourage you to read his entire speech in full. I will link to it in the show notes. But he talks about how foreign influence is a problem. He says, as avenues to foreign influence in innumerable ways, such attachments are particularly alarming to the truly enlightened and independent patriot. You are a patriot, according to George Washington, if you think of these attachments and foreign entangling alliances as alarming. That makes you a patriot, according to George Washington. He says, how many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils? Such an attachment of a small or weak towards a great and powerful nation dooms the former to be the satellite of the latter. That's Washington's warning. He says, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. He knows, he was a student of history like all of his contemporaries at that time. Even those who weren't students of history at that time were much better students of history than we are today, than me, than almost anybody alive today. And he knew through history that this type of thing was dangerous, one of the most baneful woes to a Republican government. He says, for that jealousy to be useful, it must be impartial. Else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided instead of a defense against it. And he sums it up like this. Well, there's a little bit more, but I'm going to sum it up with this one. The great conduct for us in regard to foreign nations, George Washington wrote, is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. Independence, non-intervention. It's the same advice we heard earlier in this show from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They weren't always on the same sides, those three. They certainly weren't. They didn't always have the same view of how the government should be run or how the Constitution should be structured, for example. But certainly they recognized that this foreign policy of peace and no entangling alliances was the way forward. At the end of the day, really, this disaster, this horrible humanitarian disaster in Yemen is man-made. It's caused by war, it's caused by a blockade, and it absolutely can be ended. It must be ended. Today, not tomorrow, right now. And I believe that without U.S. support, and to some degree UK support, but I can't really speak to that really, which I see, the U.S. support I see as totally immoral and totally unconstitutional. The blockade would be over. The bombing raids would be nearly done. They wouldn't have access to the hardware, the gear, etc., and the logistical support they need to be able to pull this off. And I don't really have an answer as to how to make that happen, how to get the U.S. out. But my goal with this episode is really to bring attention to this humanitarian disaster happening in the war in Yemen and show support for today's day of action to say no more war in Yemen. And it makes me think, just in closing out, of a great paper by Thomas Paine, which we're all pretty familiar with. The American, and we may not even know it's called this, but in the winter of 1776, things did not look good for the Patriots. It did not look good. I'm not talking football. December 1776, the American crisis #1. It started out, Thomas Paine said, these are the times that try men's souls. We all know that phrase. But that wasn't the only thing he included there. He said this, not all the treasures of the world could have induced me to support an offensive war, for I think it murder. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It's not happy, positive news, but it's really important stuff. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I hope you learned something. More than anything, I hope you learned something out of this. Please do check out the show notes for this. I'll get them published about a half hour to an hour after the live stream is done here in just a minute or so. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. If you support what we're doing, you like this information, you support the TAC, you can do a few easy peasy actions to help us spread the word. The mainstream platforms you may watch or listen on are very easily triggered. So leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform tells the platform to show the program to more people. On places like YouTube and Facebook, likes and shares and comments, especially in the archive after the live broadcast is over, comments, all that stuff, again, it triggers that algorithm and the program gets out to more people. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, I've seen a number of people. I will check the chat a little bit later today and the comments a little bit later today since I'm running a little longer than I was expecting to. But I'll read through those later on. But I see a number of people out there who are long time and some new actual members of the 10th Amendment Center. We couldn't get this kind of work done in support of the Constitution and liberty, the founders' vision of peace and independence, without the financial faith of our members. Our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. You can join us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thank you so much for watching again today. I hope you had a good weekend. I hope your Monday is off to a good start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.